You think the emperor's palace was all silk robes, golden halls, and polite bowing. Think again. In the shadows just beyond the throne room, you could be poisoned at a banquet, tortured in secret chambers, or forced to watch your family executed before your eyes, all without a single public trial. The Shadow Court was a hidden theater of fear, where whispers carried more power than armies, and a single wrong glance could end your life. Today, we'll uncover 7 horrors of the Emperor's secret domain that make modern political scandals look like schoolyard gossip. Picture this. The Emperor's banquet hall glows with 100 oil lamps, silk banners swaying above tables piled high with delicacies. Laughter ripples through the air. But every noble knows, every bite could be your last. In the Shadow Court, poison was not crime, it was conversation. Why send soldiers to kill an enemy when a sip of wine could do it silently? Food tasters were meant to be protection, but in this world, a taster could be bribed or was already part of the plot. Sometimes the taster dropped dead, first a warning, not a mistake. Duke Yan learned the lesson the hard way. Historical records say he laughed through an entire feast, raised his cup for the final toast, and collapsed before it touched his lips. No one moved to help him, because here, showing concern for the dying could be taken as proof you were part of the conspiracy. His body was quietly carried away. The music never stopped. A poisoned dish could mean reward or ruin. A rare delicacy might honor you or end you. And in the Emperor's realm, refusing his gift was as fatal as accepting it. Nobles tried tricks, swapping plates, pretending illness, or letting servants taste for them. But sometimes those tricks saved them, and sometimes they doomed them. The Shadow Court loved a slow kill. A poison that took days, giving enemies time to watch you weaken, was far more satisfying than one that ended quickly. And when rumors whispered that the Emperor himself sometimes chose the victim, the only safe choice was silence. If you think this was terrifying, wait until you hear about the chamber where confessions were taken without a drop of blood and where no one who entered ever walked out. They called it the place where truth went to die. No chains, no blood, no witnesses. Just a sealed room beneath the palace where the Emperor's enemies entered upright and left either broken or never at all. In the Shadow Court, it wasn't the sword that frightened you, it was the silence. The chamber was stripped bare, polished stone floor, black lacquered door, a single hanging lamp that never went dark. Prisoners were made to kneel in the center, blinded by the lamp's glare while shadows crowded the edges of the room. And then, nothing. No questions, no accusations, just waiting. Hours blurred into days. Meals arrived at random, sometimes enough for a feast, sometimes nothing but a bowl of water. Sleep was impossible under the relentless light. Guards rotated silently, their footsteps the only proof that time was still moving. The mind unraveled faster than the body. The interrogators didn't need whips or racks. They knew that isolation, disorientation, and exhaustion could make a prisoner confess to anything. Some begged to sign papers they hadn't read, just to make the waiting stop. Others began shouting secrets into the empty air, convinced someone was listening. It was perfect politics. No marks on the body meant no proof of torture. Court records described voluntary confessions from traitors who had simply seen the error of their ways. The truth didn't matter. The confession was all that counted, and the confession always came. One winter, Minister Zhao, accused of treason, was sent below during the Dragon Festival. By nightfall, his confession had been delivered to the Emperor's desk. By morning, his family's estate was in ashes. One signature could erase an entire bloodline. In the Shadow Court, the chamber wasn't about justice. It was about control. You didn't have to kill a rival in the open, you could bury them in silence. And if the silent chamber was meant to break you privately, the next horror was designed to destroy you in front of the entire court and make sure everyone remembered it. They didn't just kill you in the Shadow Court, they made sure the whole palace enjoyed the show. Public humiliation was a punishment reserved for those the Emperor wanted to erase not only from life, but from memory. If the silent chamber broke you in private, this spectacle broke you in front of everyone who mattered. The condemned would be dressed in rags dyed a sickly yellow, the official color of disgrace. A rope was tied around their neck, and they were led through the palace's grand corridors, past the ministers, generals, and concubines who once bowed to them. Now, every bow was replaced with laughter. It wasn't just a walk. The route was chosen carefully past the emperor's banquet hall, through the courtyard where officials gathered, along the balconies where favored nobles leaned forward to watch. Every step was a lesson for the living. This is what happens when you fall out of favor. Witnesses were encouraged to jeer, throw scraps, even spit on the disgraced. Court musicians played mocking tunes, their flutes and drums keeping time with the prisoners' slow march. Sometimes the emperor himself watched from behind a lattice screen, unseen but unmistakably present. Everyone knew his eyes were there, and that fear was part of the punishment. At the end of the procession, the condemned might be exiled, stripped of titles, or sent to the execution ground. But the real damage was already done. Your allies would abandon you, your family would be shunned, and your name would become a curse. Records tell of General Wei, once celebrated for victories at the border. After being accused of embezzlement, he was paraded through the court in a torn military robe. By the end of the route, his soldiers had been reassigned, his family's lands seized, and his life effectively over all, before a single judge ruled on his case. In the shadow court, humiliation could kill faster than a blade. And if being shamed before the court was unbearable, the next horror went even further. It targeted the one thing even the most ruthless official feared losing: their bloodline. In the shadow court, killing you wasn't enough. They made sure no one who shared your blood would outlive your disgrace. One sentence from the emperor could turn an entire family into ghosts, wiped from records, stripped from history, and hunted until the last name was gone. It was execution that didn't stop at the body. The order was called a root and branch purge. Root meant you, the accused. Branch meant everyone connected to you by blood, no matter how distant. Parents, children, siblings, cousins, even in-laws could be condemned. Your crime became their death sentence. This was not swift. Officials received the list of targeted names and locations. Palace guards would fan out through the city, visiting homes in silence before sunrise. Neighbors would hear nothing but the thud of boots and the crack of doors being forced open. By morning, entire households were gone. One of the most infamous cases was that of Chancellor Lin. Accused of conspiring with a foreign envoy, he was executed within a day. But the real horror came afterward. 63 members of his extended family were rounded up in less than a week. Children as young as 5 were sent into permanent exile in the northern wastelands. Elderly relatives died on the road. The Chancellor's family name was banned from being spoken in public. Even his ancestors' graves were dug up and destroyed. Why such cruelty? Because in the emperor's eyes, mercy bred rebellion. Leave one heir alive, and you plant the seed of revenge. The Shadow Court didn't just eliminate threats, it salted the earth where they had grown. Survival required impossible choices. Some officials disowned relatives preemptively, publicly declaring them dead to avoid being swept away in their fall. Others sent children into hiding, disguising them as servants or monks. But the Shadow Court spies were patient. Years later, they could still come for the last surviving branch. This wasn't punishment, it was erasure. And once the decree was issued, it was irreversible. You couldn't appeal. You couldn't negotiate. In the Emperor's world, a single accusation could turn your entire family line into a rumor, and rumors were easy to forget. But while a bloodline purge was terror in slow motion, the next horror struck instantly in the middle of court, in front of the Emperor, without a single warning. One moment you were bowing to the Emperor, the next, you were choking on the floor. In the Shadow Court, execution didn't always happen in the dungeons or on the edge of the city. Sometimes, it happened in the most public, most sacred space in the Empire, the Dragon Hall itself, because nothing terrified the court like seeing death arrive in the middle of ceremony. The Dragon Hall was the Emperor's stage, vast enough to swallow the sound of footsteps, lined with towering red pillars carved with dragons twisting toward the ceiling, and flooded with light from high bronze braziers. The jade floor was polished so perfectly that it reflected the gold-threaded robes of the ministers standing in neat rows. At the far end, on the raised throne, the emperor sat beneath the massive dragon canopy, his presence like a weight pressing down on everyone who entered. It was a place of ritual, obedience, and control. And when death struck here, it was more than punishment. It was theater. The court's daily assemblies followed an exact pattern. Reports from governors, petitions from ministers, strategic discussions with generals. But every official knew that at any moment the script could change. The emperor could decide without warning, without public accusation, that someone standing among them had outlived their usefulness. And when the emperor decided, no one was safe. It started small, a subtle shift in the air. The court readers would pause mid-scroll. The emperor's gaze would linger on one man longer than on the rest. Sometimes he would lean back, tapping the arm of his throne with a fingertip, or close his fan with a sharp snap. That was all it took for the captain of the guard to understand the command. The targeted official never saw it coming, or worse, they thought they were safe. Many deaths in the Dragon Hall began with smiles. A general might have just delivered news of victory at the borders. A minister could have received public praise for loyalty the day before. The emperor was not bound by consistency. He killed to make a point, and the point was that loyalty today meant nothing tomorrow. The moment the signal was given, the guards moved with frightening speed. They didn't announce charges. They didn't give the condemned a chance to speak. 2 men would seize the arms, another would force the victim to their knees, and the rest would clear a path down the jade steps. It was over before the whispers could start. For those unlucky enough to be executed inside the hall, the end was swift. A garrote drawn tight, a blade at the throat, the blood staining the green stone as ministers tried not to flinch. Sometimes the emperor preferred the execution just outside the Dragon Hall doors, so that the sound of the victim's final screams would carry back into the chamber. The message was unmistakable. You are here by my permission, and I can take that away at any time. The rest of the court was forced to continue as if nothing had happened. Ministers stepped over fresh blood to present reports. Petitioners bowed lower than usual, their voices trembling. Even the court musicians would resume playing, their notes shaking but steady enough to signal obedience. Because in the shadow court, the dead were gone instantly, but the living were still on display. One infamous case still appears in the annals. Minister Wrong, a man known for his eloquence and skill at calming the emperor's temper. On a winter morning, he entered the Dragon Hall, beaming after a private audience. Witnesses later recalled the emperor smiling as Wrong delivered his report. But as he turned to leave, the guards closed in. No one knows the exact accusation. Some claim he was secretly corresponding with the Empress Dowager. Others say the emperor simply grew tired of his influence. By the time the assembly ended, his body lay on the frost outside, his blood steaming in the cold air, and no one dared to speak his name again in public. These executions were never random. They were calculated, choreographed moments designed to burn themselves into memory. Killing someone in private removed them from the game. Killing them in the Dragon Hall changed the rules of the game entirely. It reminded every official that no title, no favor, no past service could protect them. If the emperor could cut down a hero in front of hundreds, then what chance did you have? There was another layer of cruelty. The families of those executed here often found themselves punished before they even received word of the death. Property seized, servants reassigned, children taken in by loyal relatives who reported on their every word. The blade in the Dragon Hall was just the beginning. For the emperor, this was control at its purest. A public death froze the court in fear. Conversations grew shorter, more guarded. Allies stopped meeting in private. Even old friends began to speak to each other as strangers. And the emperor, watching from his dragon throne, could see it working, could see his court folding in on itself. Paranoia was as effective a weapon as any sword. It's easy, centuries later, to imagine these scenes as distant history. Red silk robes, ceremonial fans, and a ruler with absolute power. But in the moment, For those standing in that chamber, each day was a gamble. You might leave with new honors, or you might not leave at all. And the worst part was knowing there was nothing you could do to control it. The Shadow Court didn't need a reason. It only needed a target. And if a public death in the Dragon Hall kept the court in line, the next horror kept them awake long after they left, because in the Shadow Court, you could be followed home, and the footsteps might never stop. In the Shadow Court, you were never alone, not in the marketplace, not in your study, not even in your own bed. The Emperor's spy network was so vast, so tangled into the daily life of the palace and the streets beyond, that you could be betrayed by the same hands that poured your wine or tucked you in at night. Because here, loyalty was not to family, or honor, or truth, it was to survival. They called them whisper collectors. Some were easy to spot court officials who lingered just a little too long near doorways, guards who always seemed to be posted within earshot, but most were invisible. They were tea sellers, lantern makers, scribes, stable boys. They were your favorite servant who remembered your birthday, or the concubine who always listened a little too carefully. The Emperor's ears could wear any face. The genius of the system was that you could never be certain who was watching. Maybe your housekeeper was loyal to you, or maybe she was loyal to the gold pressed into her hand after a midnight meeting in the servants' quarters. Maybe the scholar you confided in was trustworthy, or maybe his brother owed a debt to the palace guard. The uncertainty itself was the weapon, and these spies didn't just overhear conversations, they shaped them. They could slip forged letters into your desk, plant forbidden books in your chambers, or pass you a sealed message from an ally that would later be used as proof you were part of a plot. In the Shadow Court, evidence was a tool, not a truth. Once the right document appeared, your fate was sealed. The danger wasn't limited to the palace. In the city beyond, innkeepers reported overheard conversations in rented rooms. Moneylenders told the court about suspicious withdrawals. Merchants carried coded messages along trade routes, hidden inside bolts of silk or hollowed table legs. Even religious orders weren't free of the Emperor's reach. Monks might be tasked with recording the names and donations of worshippers, noting anyone who prayed too often for justice. Faith was no protection when the Emperor wanted your secrets. The paranoia ran deep. Some ministers dismissed loyal servants they had known for decades, replacing them monthly to avoid the slow creep of betrayal. Families began holding conversations in gardens, letting the wind rattle the leaves loud enough to cover their words. Others spoke only in half-sentences, relying on glances and pauses to carry meaning. And still, somehow secrets found their way to the throne. One story tells of General Qian, a decorated war hero who believed he could speak freely in his own home. One night, over a private dinner, he mentioned to his wife his frustration with troop shortages. 3 days later, he was in chains. The report delivered to the Emperor was signed not by a rival general, but by the family cook. In the Shadow Court, anyone could be the Emperor's ears, even the person serving your meal. And there were no safe zones. Spies listened in public baths, at funeral rites, at weddings. They lingered at the edges of family feasts, smiling politely while memorizing every word. Some even followed officials when they traveled to distant provinces, embedding themselves into the retinue as extra guards or baggage carriers. If you thought distance from the palace meant distance from the Emperor, you were already finished. The cruelest part? Sometimes the spies reported nothing at all. A report filled with silence could be more damning than one packed with accusations. If the Emperor suspected you were hiding something too well, your very lack of mistakes became suspicious. That suspicion was enough to see you dragged before the court or straight to the execution ground without a single clear charge. This network didn't just serve to uncover plots, it created obedience. When every word, every gesture, every sigh could be twisted into treachery, you didn't risk defiance. You didn't plot rebellion. You didn't even complain. The court became a place of masks, every smile calculated, every movement deliberate. You lived not as yourself, but as the version of yourself you hoped the Emperor's spies would approve of. It worked because it was endless. You could never win against the spy network, never prove your innocence once suspicion had taken root. The Emperor's agents didn't need to be everywhere, just enough of them needed to exist for everyone to believe they were everywhere. And belief, in politics, is often more powerful than truth. Some tried to play the game themselves, sending bribes or gifts to suspected spies in the hopes of securing loyalty. But the Shadow Court thrived on turning these attempts into traps. A single gift might be recorded as a bribe for treason, the proof arriving on the Emperor's desk before you even realized you'd been caught. Others attempted counter-surveillance, planting their own informants to watch the watchers, but in this tangled web, today's ally could be tomorrow's betrayer. You didn't just fear the Emperor. You feared the cook who refilled your cup. You feared the maid who lingered a moment too long in your study. You feared the old friend who asked a casual question about your health. In the Shadow Court, there was no such thing as an innocent conversation and no such thing as an unobserved one. And the worst part, when the Emperor finally decided to destroy you, you would never know which of his eyes had spotted you first. If the spies could ruin you in whispers, the next horror destroyed you in spectacle, a ritual so cruel it turned your final moments into entertainment for the court itself. They didn't just end your life, they turned it into a show. In the Emperor's Shadow Court, the final horror was a ritual designed not merely to kill, but to unmake a person in front of the very system that once applauded them. It wasn't execution, it was erasure with an audience. The summons always arrived the same way. A lacquered tablet bearing the imperial seal, delivered at dawn. You would be told to dress in court robes, not prison rags, and present yourself at the southern amphitheater of the inner city, a place built of pale stone and careful geometry. Sound carried here. Every whisper became judgment, every breath became evidence. Because the last thing the Shadow Court stole from you was privacy. Officials, generals, scribes, concubines, musicians, they came in quiet lines, faces neutral, sleeves folded just so. The Emperor would not always appear. Sometimes only his empty chair stared down from a balcony, a reminder that his absence was still more present than anyone else's presence. Across the arena floor stood a raised platform of dark wood, a silk canopy for shade, and a low table bearing brushes, ink, and paper. A band of musicians tuned their instruments. The melody would be slow, almost kind. Cruelty disguised as ceremony. First, the proclamation. A herald read your titles in full, each honor, each rank, each victory, and then read the crimes in a flat, unconcerned voice. The contrast was the point. You could be governor of the Eastern March and commander of the River Fleet, and also traitor, thief, corrupter of morals. The litany of glory was recited to make the fall steeper, the silence afterward heavier. How far you had climbed was how far you were made to fall. Then came the ritual of names. A clerk would unfurl a scroll as long as the platform and, with deliberate strokes, strike red lines through your family record. Father, grandfather, great-grandfather, not to change the past, but to reshape the future's memory. Names were officially severed, barred from memorial tablets, forbidden from ancestral rites. It was a bureaucrat's blade, clean, cold, devastating. Next, the confessions. They were already written, you would only add your signature. Sometimes the words were yours, extracted in the chamber of silent screams. Often, they were not. Refusal was allowed because refusal was useful. It proved your arrogance. Compliance was also useful. It proved your guilt. In the Shadow Court, every choice was a trap, and every trap was a choice. The spectacle began with a gesture barely visible. The overseer's hand lifted, 2 fingers like the flick of a fan. The musicians drew out a single note that felt like a held breath. Attendants approached with implements of humiliation rather than pain, a reed scepter for you to hold as a symbol of broken authority, a robe turned inside out so the seams showed, a cap tied too tight under the chin like a child's. They dressed you in the grammar of disgrace. Then the questions started. Not for truth. Truth had already been arranged. The officials below shouted scripted accusations, each one designed to strip away a layer of your identity. Who made you great? The court. Whose favor did you betray? The throne. To whom do your ancestors now answer? The Emperor. Your answers didn't matter. Your answers couldn't save you. The theater wasn't a dialogue. It was a verdict performed until it felt like nature. Prisoners sometimes tried to fight with words. Some shouted counter-accusations. Some recited poetry about loyalty. Some called on heaven. It changed nothing. The overseer would simply lift a hand, and the musicians would play louder, and the crowd would nod with relief at being told how to feel. Because nothing is safer in a murderous court than a script. The punishments varied, but all were designed to leave a shape in memory. One was called the long parting. Not a single blow, but a sequence. First, your seal ring was removed and crushed under a small mallet. The sound soft, final told the audience that your voice in state matters had ended. Next, your official tablets were snapped, each crack echoing up the stone seats. Then came the breaking of your belts and hat pins, leaving your robe to sag, a visual of authority collapsing on itself. By the time the body breaks, the person has already been dismantled. Some days, spectacle demanded swiftness. You'd be led to a willow frame and bound standing, facing the empty chair. The executioner wore no mask. Masks were for people who feared the gods. In the shadow court, impunity wore its own face. A clean stroke, a precise fall, a sheet thrown, a path cleared. The orchestra of endings played with professional rhythm. The platform was washed, the water running pink into the drains, and the next case began while steam still lifted from the wood. Because terror works best when it doesn't pause for reflection. On other days, the ritual preferred endurance. The cangue of silence, a heavy wooden collar locked around your neck, forced your chin down and your eyes up, so you could only look at the sky and the emperor's chair. You would stand for hours while scribes took turns reading out petitions you once denied, calculations you once approved, edicts you once signed. Each document was a weight. Each signature became a nail. The past was weaponized into a present you couldn't bear. And it wasn't only about you. The shadow court punished the sympathies of the living. If a friend flinched at a crack of the tablet, he might be marked. If a concubine wiped a tear, she might be reassigned to a monastery. If a junior official looked away, he might be accused of disrespect. The safest expression was none at all, a still pond, a blank scroll. Fear sculpted faces more effectively than any painter. There were stories whispered at night, never in daylight, of those who turned the theater against itself. A minister who performed his confession in verse so beautiful the crowd wept, forcing the overseer to end the ritual quickly before sympathy spread. A general who laughed as the ring shattered, declaring the throne lighter without his burden. The line became a proverb, and for that his sons were hunted. A concubine who knelt and asked to share her lover's fate. The overseer granted it, and the tale survived as a warning that courage, here, was treason by another name. The script could be bent for a moment, but never broken. What did the emperor gain by all this? More than fear. He gained architecture in the minds of his court. By staging endings as lessons, he reshaped not only behavior but imagination. After enough performances, ministers edited their own thoughts before they formed. Generals rehearsed obedience privately, so it would look effortless in public. Even the innocent learned to carry themselves like acquitted men, careful, grateful, hollow-eyed. That's the genius of spectacle. It recruits the audience into maintaining the stage. And make no mistake, the amphitheater wasn't the only theater. Markets told the story again in gossip. Scribes retold it in official narratives. Teachers wove it into cautionary maxims. Families turned it into bedtime warnings for ambitious sons. A single morning's ritual could govern a decade's worth of choices. Sometimes the emperor attended in person. He rarely spoke. He would sit with one hand on the arm of the chair, the other on his fan, and watch the unmaking like a craftsman evaluating a finished piece. If he nodded once, the crowd exhaled. If he didn't move at all, the silence thickened until even the musicians wondered if their notes were too loud. His stillness was the loudest thing in the arena. How did it end? With paperwork. Always paperwork. After the body was carried away, clerks sealed the confessions, tallied the confiscations, and marked the family registry. The amphitheater emptied. The stone dried. The instruments were wrapped. The overseer drank tea. By sunset, gardens were fragrant again. Kitchens clattered. Hawks circled above the eaves. Life rushed back in as if nothing had been removed, because that's the last trick of terror. It teaches the city to keep moving. And when night finally came, the Shadow Court survivors slept in clean beds under fine silk, dreaming of empty chairs and red lines across names. They woke with smiles fixed, voices steady, hearts trained to beat a little quieter than before. Fear had done its work, and the work was self-sustaining. So if poison at banquets was the quiet blade, the silent chamber, the invisible rack, the public procession, the lesson in humiliation, the bloodline purged the salt in the soil, the dragon hall, the thunderclap, and the spies, the air itself. This was the finale, a theater that erased the person and rehearsed the world. And now that you've seen all 7 horrors, ask yourself, which one would have broken you first, the whisper, the waiting, or the applause? Because the Shadow Court never needed you to die. It only needed you to learn the right fear, ready to retrace the path through every horror one by one and see what they reveal about power that smiles while it strangles.